No new idea has ever been proven in advance.
One of the things we're really interested in is real people.
There's no reason not to bring this skill set into your organization. I had run what was called the art department at P&G, which at the time were doing packaging. One of the designers came up to me the first day I was announced as their leader, and he said to me, "We are not the art department, we're the design department, and you don't know anything about design." And I thought, wow, well, welcome to my new assignment.
That's Claudia Kotchka speaking. She's describing her experience leading Procter & Gamble's art department in the late 90s, and her first brush with the problem-solving method known as design thinking. Hello and welcome to Shiftdisturbers, the MPI podcast that highlights the people, research, and ideas changing the way we think about the world. I'm your host, Ian Gormley, writer and content producer here at the Martin Prosperity Institute at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management. Today we're taking a closer look at design thinking. While you might not know what the term means, you've no doubt encountered many of the products the methodology has helped shape. Claudia defines design thinking as a way for companies to figure out what consumers want and how best to give that to them. Apple is probably the most famous example of a company that's incorporated design thinking into its products. But design thinking can be much more than just a way to design cooler iPhones, or in the case of Procter & Gamble, better toothpaste and razor blades. As I mentioned off the top, it's a problem-solving method that focuses on solutions rather than problems. As such, it can be applied to pretty much any problem, from product development to public policy, which is where our interest comes in. Notably, it tends to turn adherents into advocates, as it did with Claudia and our own Roger Martin, who we'll hear from later in the pod. As Claudia explains, her aha moment when she realized that design is an entirely different mindset than we're used to came only after she immersed herself amongst designers.
Designers look at the whole experience from beginning to end. When they go to school, their entire path is about problem solving. And I came from a business background, so when I started to realize they problem solve very differently than business or science. And I wanted to really understand that. I went to a conference, a design conference. It was in Boston. And that was such an eye-opening experience because I got to hear how they thought, what was important to them, what they were working on. And it was so different from anything I had experienced before. And I remember one of the speakers was the previous head of design for Philips in the Netherlands. And he talked about how they had transferred Philips from an engineering-focused company to a design-focused company. At P&G, we were still very focused on technology. We were not focused on the entire consumer experience. We were focused on the chemistry and what was in the bottle.
When people think of design, they think about how something looks, hence the art department at Procter & Gamble. But design isn't just what something looks like, it's how it works and functions. Design thinking says not only should a phone look sleek and cool, it should feel sleek and cool when you make a call, text a friend, or look up something on the internet. It's the sum total experience of the product, from the underlying technology through to the way it's packaged and sold. There are several steps in the design thinking process, including periods of research and experimentation. But the one that gets pointed to as one of the methodology's greatest strengths is the emphasis on iteration and rapid prototyping. Basically, you take a product, put it in a small-scale, real-world environment, and find out what works and what doesn't. When something doesn't work, there's always something. This is the time to go back to the drawing board and fix it, then try it again and again and again. Only when you think you've nailed it do you scale up. Once again, Apple is a great example. In this case, the process the company went through in coming up with their innovative retail stores.
They rented a warehouse in Palo Alto and built a store out of cardboard. They used the whole design thinking methodology, built it out of cardboard, brought users through. That was their prototype, and found out they had it all wrong. Tore it down and built a new one. And they kept doing that and building it out of cardboard until they knew they had magic. That's really how the methodology will work.
David M. Kelly is one of the people most often credited with taking design thinking, originally a term applied to architecture, into the business world. He founded the design firm IDEO in 1991 and used the design thinking principles as the basis for their work. By the end of the century, design thinking had expanded to tackle problems not just around consumer products, but processes and ideas as well.
It basically is problem solving, and so it can work on anything. And so It doesn't have to be a product. It can be a service. It can be a process. In fact, I would say a lot of the work being done today is on processes. When I look around the country anyway, companies that are using it are like banks and healthcare companies, hospitals. They're all using it on processes, not necessarily end products. And we used it in P&G for that as well.
In fact, disruption, a favorite word among tech companies, is itself a product of design thinking at work.
They may not call it that, but yes, absolutely, because they understand where's there a need that's not being met and how do we envision a solution that can meet that need. The world is changing so fast that you can't be the company that sits around and rests on your laurels. No one can. You've got Uber, you've got Airbnb, you've got all of these companies who are disrupting industries. That has every company realizing they need to do something different.
Roger Martin met Claudia while consulting with Procter & Gamble. He recognized the potential to take design thinking out of the boardroom and into the world. He saw it as a bridge between business and government as companies shift beyond just selling things to people to becoming thought leaders in new and emerging markets. Roger recently sat down with IDEO CEO Tim Brown at the recent Lifelong Learning Conference here at Rotman. Tim talked about the changing dynamic between big business and government.
Even very large companies like Ford need to think about their role as not necessarily individual actors anymore in the way that businesses used to when it came to strategy and innovation. They could kind of go off in the corner and decide what new truck to build or what new car to launch. But when you're trying to tackle infrastructure, that doesn't work so well, right? You have to be in some way coordinated with a lot of other kinds of organizations, maybe other businesses, cities, governments.
Meanwhile, Roger explained the role design thinking plays in that relationship. He points to a company like Ford, who are currently undergoing something of a restructuring as driverless cars and the age of smart mobility moves from science fiction to science fact to a practical part of everyday life.
Ford, essentially, has spent its lifetime selling hunks of metal to individuals, not so much to things like municipalities. Figuring out how do you take your knowledge of transportation and sell it in a productive way to somebody else while everybody's trying to figure out the city of the future and the smart mobility of the future. There's no escaping the fact there are more people and not more land, and so we've got to figure out how to be a whole lot smarter. The role of companies, I believe, should be to make the world a better place while making enough money for their shareholders and making the world a better place. And one way to make the world a better place is to do it on your own, just to come up with some new idea that you can capture enough of the value from. But in a lot of situations, you can't do it by yourself. If you do it by yourself, there are too many externalities. You do something good, you're the only cement company that reduces CO2 emissions, but if it costs you a lot to do that, chances are you'll go bust while the others don't. But if you're Wholesome, the big Dutch cement company, and you say, why don't we get all the cement companies together and all agree to sign on to the Cement Sustainability Initiative, or if it's in fisheries, it's the Marine Stewardship Council, you can actually create a transition for the whole industry. But it means kind of working together and collaborating, which lots of these companies are not great at doing, because who do they have to collaborate with? The competitors that they fight hardest with. So I do think that's something that the modern company has to think about, because I think it's so much more productive if the cement companies get together and say, here's what we're going to do, and they'll figure out how to do it and do it in an economically kind of sensible way. Then I think the optimal is for the government to come in and say, well, now that you've figured out how to do that, we'll just make it a legislation so that the cheaters can be punished to a greater extent and cheating is going to be less prevalent. What you get is the world being a better place because a bunch of companies got together, did something good, and then the government then can react to that rather than having to put together what might end up being sort of ham-fisted.
Because that makes the legislative process then much more like a design process.
Yes.
Because you build a prototype, the companies build a prototype, figure out what works, and then the legislation is the sort of the formalization, recognition that you've got a prototype that works. And I've run a couple of sessions at the World Economic Forum over the last couple of years with regulators and tech companies struggling to figure out the regulation thing. Right?
Yes. Yes.
Airbnbs and Ubers of the world, struggling to figure out how to work with cities and national governments. And interestingly enough, when I do bring these people together, they almost always come to the conclusion that they need a design process. Because what they try to do is they use a specification-driven process, which nearly always gets it wrong, because they think,
bureaucratic. Yeah.
Make a bunch of regulations, and then go try to build something, and find it doesn't work, it's too complicated, nobody knows how to behave within it.
I don't think government is dumber or something, but the typical process there is exactly that. You kind of work to get some legislation passed, and then it's sort of fixed in stone. If you look at something like Dodd-Frank, it was this massive piece of legislation, and then once it was done, it was like, okay, now we just go do this. But it's so complicated. If instead it was like, here's our first prototype of Dodd-Frank, let's get that out working and see if it works, and improve it. But that's not how the legislative process works. But I think that's one of the reasons why we've got such gridlock, is people fight so hard because once it's in, it's set, instead of not fighting as hard because you're not saying anything is set.
But research and iteration can only go so far when you're talking about theoretical concepts like the kind often contemplated by policymakers. You can't build government programs out of cardboard. A core principle of design thinking is to begin with a deep understanding of real users. Jennifer Riel is Managing Director of Strategy and Innovation with Rogers' infrastructure team here at MPI. As she explained, in trying to incorporate real people into research and development, design thinkers often turn to something called personas.
The core philosophy of how we do our work has been and remains based in the principles of design thinking, right? And so persona is a description of your user. And typically in the world of design, it is something that is abstracted from a group of users. You go out and you interview a whole bunch of people and you create an idealized version of a customer. And in this particular case, because one of the things we're really interested in at Martin Prosperity Institute is focusing on real people instead of imaginary or theoretical people like think tanks often do, we wanted to make each persona a real person. So they are stories and descriptions and personification of real people that we went out and interviewed.
This approach became the basis for MPI's Persona project, an attempt to link our theoretical policy work around democratic capitalism with the real people who would ultimately be impacted by our policy goals. The project is the brainchild of Quinn Davidson, a colleague of Rogers at MPI.
We've been doing a lot of research that was very data-driven about certain segments of the population. And as I was thinking about these design books that I'd been reading, I said, wouldn't it be great if we could talk about that segment of the population, but then say, would that really work for Bob the Builder, so to speak? So as a way to ground some of our research to real people, and a persona would be a tool with them around the room kind of thing, where we could have these really interesting theoretical conversations that we do here, but then drive and anchor them with a visual and an idea of a real person in mind.
In building the project, members of Rogers' team interviewed a cross-section of Americans from different socioeconomic and political stripes to create a set of archetypes. Those archetypes form a base of users whose points of view we can refer to when putting our work through the design thinking process. What's good for Greg, the staunch conservative who's got the future figured out, doesn't necessarily work for Ida, a driven social worker working on the front lines of poverty. The advantage that design tools like iteration and personas give is a data stream that would otherwise be unattainable.
One of the interesting things about data, right, is what era is all the world's data from? The past. So whenever you're analyzing the past. And of course, if you analyze the past and draw a judgment from it, you're making an assumption. The future will be the same as the past. So the interesting thing about the design method, the core elements of the design method, is it manufactures data in the future that helps you get something to be better. What rapid prototyping is doing is manufacturing data that does not now exist. We don't have data about how a new thing that customers have never seen will interact with said customers. But if you give them a prototype and then watch them with it, voila, you've got data. And so I've always viewed the best designers are people who can productively turn the future into the past. Designers, I think, are good at saying, we don't know if this thing will work because there is no data about this new thing, but we're going to try it, and we're going to watch, and we expect to see the following. And again, a good designer will say, we'll expect to see some things about it that they like and some things about it that they don't like. And when we figure out what they do like and what they don't like, we can try the next iteration, and we won't have any, we don't know what will happen until they get that next iteration, but we suspect there'll be some things they do like and some things they don't like. What you've done is manufactured a data stream that didn't exist that aids you in making your product, service, offering, whatever it is, environment better than it was. No new idea has ever been proven in advance.
So as we can see, design thinking is far beyond the art department that Claudia encountered 20 years ago. It's an entirely different way of problem solving that can be incorporated into almost any walk of life.
Roger helped us integrate it into all of our disciplines. Our supply chain, our marketing, our scientists. We integrated it everywhere. It's easy to learn. People should all learn it because if you're going to get disrupted, even if you're not, there's no reason not to bring this skill set into your organization. It's just another skill set that everyone should have.
That does it for us for another episode of Shiftdisturbers. Hopefully you can see how design thinking can impact your line of work or even your personal life. A big thanks to Claudia Kotchka, Jennifer Rial, and Quinn Davidson for their time. If you'd like to learn more about design thinking, Tim Brown's book, Change by Design, How Design Thinking Transforms Organizations and Inspires Innovation, and Roger Martin's Design a Business, Why Design Thinking is the New Competitive Advantage, are good places to start. And if you'd like to learn more about the MPI Persona Project, head to personaproject.martinprosperity.org. A huge thanks for listening to Shiftdisturbers. This episode was written and produced by myself, Ian Gormley. If you want to know more about the goings-on around the Martin Prosperity Institute, head over to martinprosperity.org or follow us on Twitter @martinprosperity. That's MartinProsperit. To make sure you never miss an episode of Shiftdisturbers, click the subscribe button. If you like what you hear, please take a minute and leave a review. And don't be afraid to tell a friend about us. Once again, I'm Ian Gormley. Thank you for listening.